Hello, everyone. My name is Katie Staal. I'm the Senior Publishing Editor for Politics Textbooks at Oxford University Press. And thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for our British Politics webinar. So we have two fantastic OUP authors speaking today. We've got Andrew Blick and Peter John. But before I introduce them, I thought I'd just start with some quick housekeeping bits and pieces. So this session is an hour long. The first 40 minutes will be our discussion, and then we've left 20 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. So please do post questions into the chat bar as you think of them throughout the session, and we'll go back through these and answer them at the end. So as you can see, the theme of this webinar is British Politics since 2019, an exploration of change and consequence. And our aim is to highlight and explain the most pressing issues that have emerged in the last 2.5 years of Conservative government under Boris Johnson's leadership. And importantly, our authors today are also going to illustrate why we should care about all of these pressing issues. So a bit about the structure of the discussion. It's in two halves. Firstly, covering UK political leadership, and then we'll move on to talk about the future of the UK and our place in the world. So moving on to introduce our speakers today, Andrew Blick is a Professor of Politics and Contemporary History at King's College London. Andrew brings a wealth of academic knowledge, but also practical experience, having held various positions in think tanks and even in the office of the Prime Minister. Andrew is the author of our textbook, UK Politics, which published this July. And UK Politics really foregrounds Andrew's expertise in history, where he explains how historical events have helped to get us to where we are today. And we're also joined by Peter John. Peter is a Professor of Public Policy, also at King's College London. He's written several books on policy and agenda setting and is an expert in political behaviour. Peter's textbook, British Politics, an Analytical Approach, published just a few days ago. So massive congratulations to Peter. Happy publication week. And now everyone can get their orders in just in time for Christmas, if you so wish. British Politics provides a unique analysis of the subject by exploring key methods and theories to help understand the current debates which shape British politics and policy today. So political turbulence is a key theme running throughout Peter's book, and you'll hear much more on how students and researchers can navigate the increasingly turbulent waters of UK politics. As I kick off our discussion now, so as I mentioned, we're going to start by looking at UK political leadership, specifically with our first question that I'm actually going to direct towards Peter. So Peter, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what makes a good Prime Minister, and also how has Boris Johnson performed?
Thank you, Katie, and thank you, OUP, and all the people who've helped with the book. And it's great the book is coming out this week. And I'm going to talk about leadership. And I think the last 10 days of British politics, with government racked with scandals about parties happening in Number 10 and elsewhere during the lockdown of 2020, I think really poses the question about the kind of skill and judgment of the person who is responsible for the operation at the central government, the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And I think even though we know that accidents always happen in politics, the Christmas parties incident conveys the idea that a lot of these kind of mess ups at the centre are rather self-inflicted and come from Boris's allegedly rather chaotic style, his allegedly poor decision making, that he's supposed not to have a great deal of grip on the detail, and he prefers obfuscation and delay. So with the Christmas parties, the advice that's come down is, well, if he'd actually seized on this a bit earlier, got a grip on it, got everything, sort of reported squarely, he might not be in such a mess as he is currently. So in some ways, I think the current crisis could be a kind of metaphor for Johnson's sort of style. But I'll come back to that in a minute and see whether these criticisms are kind of fully justified. But I think this question really illustrates, the importance of the Prime Minister, who is actually central to British politics. In spite of all the decentralisation, the devolution that's happened, and Andrew's going to talk about that later, the Prime Minister is kind of core to the political system. And this is why, actually, in my book, I kind of have a whole chapter associated to executive leadership. It's the nature of this office is very much tied up with some core features of British politics: the delegation of executive power from the monarch to the Prime Minister, to the executive, that of party leadership being absolutely central to British politics, and the importance of that party having a majority in the House of Commons to get its business done. Then the lack of the full separation of power, the limited checks and balances. So the whole of Westminster kind of model, as it were, is really tied up with the kind of power and influence of the kind of Prime Minister. And a lot of discussions about prime ministers, particularly by famous writers on British politics, the late Tony King from University of Essex, say that actually has a lot more power than other equivalent premiers, much more powers over appointment and dismissal of ministers and other officials as well. But at the same time as having all this power, the Prime Minister is actually a kind of very tough job that can almost wipe out anyone, because it needs multiple skills: the skills of party leader, executive decision maker, somebody who has control of the implementation process, somebody who can kind of face the media, has to face the House of Commons. I was just watching Prime Minister's Question Time just now, seeing Boris under scrutiny. And then obviously somebody who actually is able to operate in the international arena and get on with other leaders and craft international policy, which I'm going to talk about a bit later. And at the same time, this very office is actually often insecure because there's no security of tenure. There's no kind of fixed term office. They can be chucked out by their party at any time. And it possibly the case they don't have enough support around the Prime Minister, and it's actually quite hard to delegate decisions. And we saw when Boris got ill during the early parts of the COVID crisis that it was quite hard for the government. The government did keep on going. The cabinet kept on going, but it kind of needed that kind of central person at the heart of the machine. So in a sense, a lot of attention is about the character of that person and who they are, and also how they develop an office. And obviously PMs, they come from within their parties. They're party politicians. They're not necessarily trained to be Prime Minister or ministers. They may have some government experience, but probably not the same as being Prime Minister. And also, like politicians, they have their own vanity. They have their own self-belief. And they actually, even being in office can create these kind of delusions of power. And we've seen in the past really powerful prime ministers like Margaret Thatcher, who was Conservative leader in the 1980s, started off very powerful, but in the end, a whole series of self-inflicted errors meant that she, in the end, was kicked out by her own party. And Tony Blair, who did stand aside of his, the Labour leader in the 1990s and early 2000s, in the end, he ended his office not quite on that same kind of elan that he did as when he started. So in some ways, I think we need to be sort of careful when judging Boris, because the job itself is just incredibly tough. It's really tough for anybody to get right. And I suppose what people say about Johnson is that perhaps he doesn't have that degree of seriousness and ability to sort of master the brief, master the details. So Dominic Cummings, his kind of former advisor number 10, used to describe the chaotic nature of the meetings. He said it was a bit like Boris Johnson was a bit like a shopping trolley who kind of echoed from, ricochet from one side to another, and then eventually ended up with a decision. Now, obviously, that could be a little bit of sour grapes there. Obviously, former advisors, may not necessarily be complimentary about their former bosses. And I think we need to be careful with Boris, because when he was mayor of London, head of the Great London Authority, before he came to Parliament, he was, though he had his hiccups, his mess ups, he actually delegated power to deputy mayors. And he really got on with the kind of the public image of being mayor, and actually learned how to go. And a part of the art of having power is an ability to delegate. We don't necessarily want micromanagers. And Gordon Brown, for example, a former Labour leader, was allegedly a micromanager. It would be like staying up all night trying to get all the paperwork done. is that really a sensible thing? We want somebody who has the kind of judgment, ability, and also ability to persuade people, ability to engage the kind of public. So I'm trying to suggest here that maybe we ought to be a little bit more generous to Boris and judge him over the long term. But let's have a look at some examples of where he's either done well or bad. And some of these examples kind of play both ways. And my student essays sometimes, which I've just finished reading, you can see that the really good students are able to use examples and get it to kind of point both ways. So let's look at one example, which is the December 2019 election, where Johnson got this kind of stonking majority of 80, which eluded, Cameron, his predecessor, Theresa May, and in some ways this looked like a kind of a clever manoeuvre. That after the sort of paralysis of the Theresa May years, after 2016, after 2017, the disastrous Theresa May election, a lack of majority, Boris inherited that. But he was able to ensure the opposition kind of didn't play their hand correctly, got the election, and then got this fantastic victory. But was that accident? Was he just in the right place at the right time? It was really luck that got him there. And it may be the case that the cards were just going to fall, and all he had to do was shout, "Get Brexit done!" In the election, and that was going to swing many voters. So again, a kind of double-edged example. Second example is the kind of Brexit deal, and I sense the closure of that deal. Now, since there's a huge uncertainty about that deal, we thought there wouldn't be a withdrawal agreement for getting out of the EU, there wouldn't be a kind of trade deal. But Boris, to his credit, he managed to get these things done right last minute. But actually got these things in place. And this might suggest that he's kind of pragmatic. He's actually able to cut deals, or at least allow his subordinates to cut those deals. And also it shows him he's getting on quite well with other leaders, like the Irish Taoiseach, for example, and getting the Irish protocol together. And even Macron. It was obviously, the French are sort of, up in arms about the British quite a lot, but Boris actually got on well. Do you remember when he went to the Élysée Palace and he walked in and he sort of got sat in the big room and put his feet on some rather posh looking sort of Versailles looking kind of chair, and Macron was kind of astonished at this, but Boris got on with these people, so I think that actually is an important skill. But maybe a lot of these deals are all done too quickly at the last minute, and the government itself is trying to unravel the Northern Irish Protocol. And the final two things, just briefly, I don't want to go over my 10 minutes. The whole COVID is a real sort of test case for Boris. Did he, in March, just delay decision-making? He didn't make decision-making quick enough. And again, in the lockdown in November. And even now, should they really be acting faster? But of course, as we know from the massive defeat from yesterday, where Boris, had about 100 Conservative MPs voting against it, you can see how difficult it is and how he's kind of constrained. So it may not necessarily be indecisive; it may be just the cards which he's dealt. Other good things about Boris is I think he's picked quite a good team. I mean, if you think of people like Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary. He has, a bit like the GLA, got these kind of talented ministers as him. And people do say, well, what about the advisors? And maybe one of the reasons you maybe need a better team actually in number 10. So sort of concluding, I think we ought to have a kind of a balanced approach to Boris Johnson. It's obviously too early to say. I think historians need to go through all the records. And like MPs, he has to, like all with PMs, he has to learn the art of survival. It is actually although parties can kick out PMs, it's quite hard to kick them out. And I suppose the real question is, to what extent he'll be a kind of powerful electoral politician coming up to the 2024 elections, and that will be his kind of key test, surviving to that point and seeing whether. And obviously, if he is able to deliver a majority for the Conservatives, then all these people who are kind of so critical will be changing their points of view. So. Hopefully, so that was hopefully a slightly alternative take on Boris Johnson than you might be reading in the current newspapers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Some really good points there and really good coverage of very recent, you mentioned a vote that happened yesterday, events in British politics. So now turning to Andrew, I wanted to zoom in even more on Boris Johnson as a PM. And the question that I'm going to pose to you is there such a thing as Johnsonism?
Good, thank you, Katie. And I think one of the comments asked if we could call him Johnson, so or not call him Boris. So that's certainly where this question is leading, which is quite neat as well. And thanks, Peter, and congratulations on the publication of the book. Sometimes the name of a senior politician, often a prime minister, not always, but often a prime minister, becomes associated with a particular program or set of ideas. For instance, Thatcherism, the term Thatcherism broadly refers to the free market approach combined with social conservatism of Margaret Thatcher, who was a Conservative Prime Minister from 1979 to 1990. Getting a bit more recent, the term Blairite now sometimes refers to those within the Labour Party who, following the lead or the example of Tony Blair, the Labour Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007, following that lead, they favour a more centrist Labour Party, accepting market forces in a way that some further to the left within Labour do not accept. So these kind of labels can be a compliment, it can be a term of abuse, or there can be a neutral description according to whether it be who's using them. If an admirer might regard them as a compliment, an opponent might see them as a term of abuse, and an analyst such as myself might try and use them to describe. But they suggest that the leader concerned stood for some kind of coherent collection of values and policies. So the question really is it therefore appropriate to talk about Johnsonism in this light, the idea that Johnson has a coherent collection of values and policies? Now, some might tend to dismiss Boris Johnson as being little more than an ambitious opportunist, strong on style but lacking in substance. And a good example, I suppose, a good case for that argument, the kind of the critique that says there isn't such a thing as Johnsonism, could be his behaviour in relation to the European Union referendum of 2016. Now, some of you may remember, may have been following this at the time, but the UK on 23rd of June 2016 had a vote on whether or not to remain within or leave the European Union, the supranational political and economic project, a predecessor to which the UK had first joined in 1973. On that occasion, there was a majority, about 52%, slightly under 52%, in favour of leaving. We'll come back to some of that later on today. But what was interesting was that Johnson was a leading figure within the Leave campaign. So he backed what turned out to be the winning side. And that eventually helped to get him, or was the main driving factor in him being where he is now at number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister. But in fact, it's known that in advance of that referendum, before choosing a side, he'd actually prepared two different articles, one in favour of remaining and one in favour of leaving. So the charge that of Johnson as opportunist who doesn't really believe in anything, is more interested in partying perhaps than actually having firm beliefs, could be supported by that view. Here's over such an important issue involving the future of the UK, he doesn't really have an opinion, and he picks the one which, in a kind of high stakes gamble, gets him to number 10 Downing Street and gets him to the office of Prime Minister. So you could make that case, but I would also say we've got to look at this from other sides, and others might associate a particular distinctive kind of conservatism with Johnson. It's useful, again, to think about the basis on which he became both leader of the Conservatives and Prime Minister in mid-2019. The background context, as I said, was the political instability generated by the EU referendum and the Leave vote of 2016. And by mid-2019, the kind of political chaos that unfolded because of that vote left the Conservative Party feeling in a desperate position. They actually came fifth in a UK-wide election, which is completely unprecedented for the Conservative Party, the elections to the European Parliament held in May of that year. And they really felt they were headed towards some kind of political disaster, some kind of electoral disaster. And at that point, Theresa May stood down as leader, and the Conservative Party turned to Johnson because he was the only person that they felt probably who actually had the potential to turn things around then politically. And as Peter's already said, he was successful at doing so. And at the general election of December 2019, later that year, constructed a new base of support, of electoral support for the Conservative Party. In particular, what's received a lot of attention is the way in which he won new seats for Conservatives in Parliament that were previously Labour strongholds, such as in northeast of England, Bishop Auckland and Sedgefield being examples of two seats within what was known as the Red Wall, the seats that were believed to be safe Labour seats that flipped over to the Conservatives in 2019. So one way of understanding the new base of support he built is through Brexit, because under Johnson, the Conservatives were very effective at unifying Leave voters behind them, while the Remain voters divided between different parties. And in the UK parliamentary electoral system, the first past the post system, this dispersal of votes was very useful, because under that system, potentially, if you can combine votes in that way, you can win a majority of seats in the House of Commons without getting a majority of votes cast. Brexit's therefore very important to an understanding of Johnsonism, however he came to support it, and it certainly propelled him to power. But it's not the whole of Johnsonism, if there is such a thing. His appeal to his support base, particularly in Red Wall seats, is also founded in a commitment, rhetorically at least, to what's known as levelling up, what he terms levelling up. Another one of these very effective Johnson slogans alongside Get Brexit Done. And the term levelling up implies intervention and large-scale public expenditure designed to equalise social opportunity across the UK. And this aspect of Johnsonism makes it pretty distinct, and certainly distinguishes it, for instance, Thatcherism, which I was talking about earlier, with its free market connotations, or more recently to the commitment to austerity pursued under the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron. And austerity meaning being very careful about how you spend money, not spending more than you need, introducing cuts for the sake of fiscal stability, etc., etc. He's really moved away from that into a different place, which suggests maybe there is a distinctive thing called Johnsonism. Another useful term, I don't think it's the whole of the explanation of Johnson and Johnsonism, but a term that's sometimes applied is that of populism. Now, we're entering into a complex subject here, but populism could be broadly defined as a political approach, or perhaps ideology, by which a single leader or a movement presents itself as the only legitimate vehicle for the will of the people. And it presents itself as battling against shadowy elites that are seeking to frustrate that will. It often defines the people in an exclusive way, excluding, for instance, migrants. I think when we think about Johnsonism, how to define what Johnson is about, there is some value in using this populism concept. For instance, the way in which he and members of his government have a tendency to depict themselves as representing the will of the people, as expressed through the referendum of 2016 or the general election of 2019, in the face of treacherous elite groups such as the judiciary, the civil service, the BBC, and of course, certainly up to leaving the European Union. And Johnson also, in another perhaps populist way, makes a virtue of not being bound by traditional rules and norms, the code of once what was called the good chap. And that tendency has been part of his appeal, but also we're seeing lately, as Peter was discussing earlier, it can also create problems for him, but it perhaps is part of what we might call Johnsonism. Now, it's difficult to know exactly how we will eventually come to regard Johnson, and whether he will be defined to get his own word, to get an ism or an ite, whether it be Johnsonites or Johnsonism. He may or may not be in the early stages of his premiership. He may be in the mid stages. He may be in the late stages. We don't know. That's what history is about. You don't know when you're living through it how it's going to work out. At this equivalent point for Margaret Thatcher, for instance, it wasn't entirely clear what Thatcherism was. And in many ways, Thatcher and other prime ministers make it up as they're going along. Perhaps something at the charge level that Johnson, but you could say that of many prime ministers. Thatcherism now seems very clear to us, but it wasn't the way it was at the time. So in the end, we'll have to leave this eventually to the historians.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Some really thoughtful points there about Johnson and Johnsonism. So some key themes emerging throughout those two kind of discussion points is, well, political turbulence. It continues. Uncertainty. It's a feeling that we have in day-to-day politics. So now, this second half of the discussion, we're going to focus on the UK and more specifically our place in the world in the midst of all this political chaos. But as a starting point, I thought we could actually zoom in to take a closer look at the UK itself, particularly devolution and the implications of the UK having devolved powers. So the next question, we're going to return back to Andrew again. And the question I have for you is, what is the significance of territorial politics to the UK as a state?
Good. So when writing the book, one of the interesting things I kind of came to realize was this interesting contrast in the nature of the way the UK is organized politically. And as Peter said earlier, in many ways, central government is very important to the UK. Whitehall and Westminster, some big decisions are taken there. Everybody knows that a general election to the House of Commons is incredibly important for who holds power in the UK. But at the same time, running in parallel to that, you have this remarkable degree of divergence within the UK. The UK used to sometimes be called a unitary state, meaning all the powers held at the main powers held at the centre, and there's a kind of uniform system across the whole UK. That term doesn't really get used anymore when people talk more about multinational state or a union state. And when we think about the UK, it's important to bear in mind that it does have the important subgroups within it. It has sub-nations within it, including the three main nations being Wales, Scotland and England. And then also we have this territory, Northern Ireland, which can't quite be defined as a nation, but is certainly an important component of the UK. So there's a lot of variety there. There's a lot of linguistic variety with many, actually quite a lot of different languages spoken within the UK that originate in the UK, such as Welsh, such as Scots, such as Gaelic. Even in Cornwall, a relatively small number of people report that they speak Cornish. So there's a lot of cultural variety, there's a lot of linguistic variety, religious differences. You have an established church in England, a different established church in Scotland, no established church in Northern Ireland, and a pretty much no established church in Wales. So there's a lot of differences there. And obviously more recently, after an experiment in devolution in Northern Ireland that ran from the 1920s to the 1970s, we've seen devolution introduced to Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales starting in 1999. Under that form of devolution, you actually have directly elected lawmaking assemblies or parliaments that have quite significant responsibilities. And I think during the pandemic, and even today we're seeing this, we see the potential for divergence, which wasn't necessarily anticipated when devolution was being devised and implemented in the late 1990s, that actually in a situation like the one with the pandemic, something funny happened there, in the pandemic, that actually be the potential for such great variation in policies pursued. So there's a lot of divergence, there's a lot of difference in parallel to this also in some ways centralized system. But in many ways, the Brexit vote, the European Union referendum vote of 2016 has helped to upend a lot of these certainties. There was already pressure on the future of the Union in the sense that in 2014, there was a referendum in Scotland on whether or not it should become independent and leave the UK. It voted by roughly 55% to 45% to stay within the UK. But the fact that the referendum had been held and that 45% of people taking part were willing to vote to leave was significant. But the Brexit vote has really caused a lot more uncertainty around the future of the Union, I think. Overall, as I've said, there was a 51.2% vote in favour, 51.8%, sorry, vote in favour of leaving. But there's a lot of divergence, territorial divergence within that vote. Wales voted 52.5% to leave. Scotland, on the other hand, voted 62% to remain. Northern Ireland voted 55.8% to remain. And within that, within Northern Ireland, there's a sub-split with the Protestant Unionist community who want to remain part of the UK, voting by a small majority to leave the European Union, while the Catholic nationalist community, who broadly want to leave the UK and join with the Republic of Ireland, voted by a large majority to remain within the European Union. And then finally, within England, there was a 53.4% leave majority, but divergence within England itself. For instance, London voted by nearly 60% to remain within the European Union. So you can see that the referendum is in some ways quite a diversive force that's created a lot of instability and uncertainty around the future of the Union. And to pick some examples, what happens to the powers that are brought back from the European Union that were previously exercised at Brussels level for Europe as a whole? Those powers have come back to the United Kingdom since it left the European Union, but where do they go? That's led to a big argument. Should they be kept at the UK centre, or should they be dispersed down to devolved levels? Within that, we've also got the fact that within England, we don't have the same kind of evolution that we have in other parts of the UK. I don't know what's going on with the sound, but I'll just keep going. I hope you can hear me. Very odd, isn't it? Anyway, within that, we don't have. There's lots of uncertainty, and the referendum result will certainly revive the Scottish independence question, with people within Scotland who support leaving the European Union able to claim that they're being forced out of the European Union against their will because they wanted to remain. And in Northern Ireland, it's created real issues, and that's the thing I'll kind of finish with today. If I've got time for that still, I'll talk about the strains on Northern Ireland produced by Brexit. Northern Ireland has been a site of a sometimes violent conflict going back really centuries over what its status should be. Should it be part of the UK, or should it be part of an independent Republic of Ireland? Should it join with the rest of the island of Ireland and become a single independent state? As I said, there's division between two different communities within Northern Ireland. Some of that violence was eliminated, not entirely, but there was certainly a pretty successful peace process, which led in particular to the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement of 1998. Under that agreement, to which the UK is a signatory as long as the Republic of Ireland and various parties in Northern Ireland and the United States, there's an agreement that the future of Northern Ireland, its status, whether it's within the UK or within the Republic of Ireland, will be determined by the people of Northern Ireland. And this takes us to an interesting concept: sovereignty. Sovereignty meaning the political control over a particular territory. The word in its origins, I suppose, refers to monarchs and the authority they possess, but now it tends to mean more about a state, a political system having control over its own affairs. So in a sense, if you look at the peace process and the Belfast and Good Friday Agreement, sovereignty has been vested in the people of Northern Ireland over their own future. However, that's quite difficult to reconcile with Brexit, which for many people who support it, asserting sovereignty over its own affairs. So how do we mesh these two things together? A way of dealing with that is the so-called Northern Ireland of the exit agreement. That's the way we've come up with as managing it. That's the thing that it was very difficult sticking with negotiations with the European Union before we left. And the way in which that handles this problem of sovereignty and what should the states of Northern Ireland, particularly given the Remain majority in the referendum, is that Northern Ireland, in effect, remains part of key aspects of the European Union, in particular the customs union and the single market, while technically still being part of the UK. So basically, it's a kind of a fudge, which has a kind of deals with the sovereignty issue by sharing it between two different institutions in effect. The problem there is that the only way that that can be managed under current arrangements is by having some kind of effectively border between Great Britain, the larger island, the United Kingdom, and Northern Ireland. So the border goes down the Irish Sea, and that's been a hugely controversial issue, particularly as well as among the Conservative government, which initially signed up to this agreement, now doesn't like it as much, but also amongst a lot of unionists in Northern Ireland who don't like the idea of being cut off from the rest of the United Kingdom, which they want to remain part of. So these are some really difficult to resolve issues we're going to face going forward, and they'll be particularly challenging in terms of the relationship between the UK post-Brexit and the European Union. Lately, the UK government has backed off the idea of unilaterally pulling out of the Northern Ireland Protocol, but it's still got the potential, I think, to undermine that relationship and also compromise relationships with other powers such as the US, which has a keen cultural interest in the future of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Sorry, everyone, about the standard issue technical problems with the sound quality there. I hope that you got most of that, because it was a really comprehensive overview of the kind of tensions within the UK and within the devolved powers, especially post-Brexit. So finally, we're only going to talk for a couple of minutes. Back to Peter again. So you are our policy expert, policy and policy making expert. So as a final question, I wanted to ask you, what are the implications of current policy on the future direction of the UK?
Thank you, Katie. And by the way, I'm enjoying the discussion in the chat about Johnson, and look forward to responding to that later. Yeah, and I think the topic is about sort of, the sense, the international dimension of British politics, and there's a slight tendency to sort of separate that off and see that as something quite separate from all the other things we're studying in British politics. And I think in the book, what I try to do is to try and put that together and say, what if you're studying international politics, these things are intimately connected with what's going on domestically, particularly party politics, and sort of draw on the ideas of Jim Bullpitt, which actually really is also really quite useful for the kind of devolution sketch, which we've been talking about just now. So the idea is that what these party elites do is they try and create this external support system internationally, so it allows them to sort of operate more effectively in the kind of national context and get kind of partisan advantage. So that's the kind of basic idea. So, and I think it's important to have a kind of historical perspective. And of course Andrew here is the historian, so I'm sort of giving tribute to that. And I think obviously we need to look at, to understand where we are currently, we need to have a kind of quite a long perspective. And one is the kind of past importance of Britain as an imperial power, as a victor of the Second World War, and getting its kind of place in international organizations and quite a lot of kind of leverage. And obviously then the move to join the European Economic Community in 1973 as a kind of response to that declining power. In a sense, you can see this sort of statecraft, this is the kind of key term that Bullpitt uses, to basically sort of use the European Union as a kind of a way to sort of deal with issues in domestic politics in terms of the economy. And I think it's important to understand, what happened in that period. And in my course, we talk about Stephen George and his book on the awkward partner. Was Britain an awkward partner? Evidence, no, not entirely consistent with that. And you can see the kind of legacy of British investment in public policy in Europe in terms of things like trading standards, whole single European market, whole sets of policy architectures that was being created. But in the end, it didn't work. We got to the kind of Brexit vote, and one of the things we do in the course is talk about how we got there. Was it something that was inevitable? What role did contingency play in getting there? And I think the article by Helen Thompson, University of Cambridge, it really looks at this really carefully. So I think it's important to take that historical perspective. And now we are sort of out of the European Union and seeking to sort of create a kind of international, strategy based on, the existing sort of leverage that Britain has in terms of international organisations, ability to kind of create kind of trade deals. And obviously, it has its challenges. That in a sense, Britain is between large trade blocks. European Union is now a kind of rival trade bloc, as it were. and obviously there are the kind of the US, China, and other entities which Britain has to sort of find influence in, and obviously is able to use its institutional position. Obviously, we've just been through the COP26 talks, which Britain led, the United Nations Climate Change Conference. Again, you can see Britain trying to exercise leadership, and obviously it's going. Obviously, there's different views about how well that conference went, and obviously some things were good, others less good. But you can see Britain sort of trying to sort of shape international policy. And then obviously there is the importance of kind of securing sort of trade deals. And again, I think, if you're going back to the statecraft argument, the challenge for political leaders is to deliver sort of trade alliances which then yield that economic benefit, and for that to then feed into partisan advantages. And that's obviously very difficult in terms of obviously very difficult to get a trade deal with the United States at the moment. And obviously there's quite a lot of challenges in balancing domestic politics with international politics. And in the book, I've got a sort of case study of how policies on China have changed, and obviously the challenge of dealing with human rights concerns, security, but at the same time having sort of affected trade relationship. And of course, we left the EU, but of course the EU has not gone away. It's the major trading partner, and in order to trade, you have to have agreements. You have to have ability to sort of recognise each other's standards. So the whole issue of negotiating public policy in relationship to EU is an ongoing challenge, and will remain so as negotiations, as treaties sort of change. So, Britain's in obviously it's a new place. Some of the old challenges remain, and then new ones emerge. And obviously, we've got to see how things develop. Whether the change in government in Germany would lead to slightly better relationships. Whether Macron, when he's got if he gets re-elected, will he sort of start to amp down the conflict over things like fishing? And that's fact. Interestingly, you can see the kind of pragmatism emerging recently in the kind of fishing dispute about the licenses to French ships. Basically, they've now been sort of recently issued out. There's talk of a little bit of a climb down over the Northern Ireland Protocol, and the rhetoric of triggering Article 16 to sort of shake up the protocol. Now less so. So you can see these kind of pragmatism, trying to actually craft out alliances and deal with relative position is the kind of core to international policy, and then also how it then interfaces with domestic sort of politics. So that's me.
Thanks very much, Peter. Again, a really comprehensive overview of the UK's external politics. Fantastic. Thank you very much. That is the end of the discussion portion. Ooh, I'm getting a bit of feedback. Yourself on mute. And then we should minimize there we go. Okay, thank you very much for listening to our discussion. Lots of really thoughtful and thought-provoking points covered by our authors. Thank you also for a very lively chat bar. We've even got recommended reading being thrown around in there, which is fantastic. So we're going to use the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar to move on to the Q&A part of the session. And I am going to go into the chat and see what questions we've been getting throughout the session for our authors. Okay, wonderful. Right, so the first one is from Dr. Stephen Wilkinson. I think this is tying back into the first part of the discussion where we talked about Johnson and Johnsonism, particularly in regards to the last election. So Stephen asks, are you therefore arguing that the Conservative Party has actually become a Brexit party? He only got the job because he was the only politician that could deliver the majority they wanted. So Peter or Andrew, did you want to take that one? Is the Conservative Party now the Brexit party?
I can do that one if you want. I think definitely there's been a marked change in the nature of the Conservative Party, and Johnson coming to power probably put there by other forces within the party who didn't necessarily and don't necessarily even trust him, as we've seen last night. Put him there, that was a change. There's also a product of long-term tendencies in the party that over a long period of time, back to the late 80s, it became, having been the party of Europe, it became increasingly hostile to the European project. So I think there has definitely been a marked shift, and there's definitely, and obviously some people were very deliberately driven out of the party and left. So you can say that, but it's not complete break with the party. And obviously the Conservative Party has been around for a long while, hasn't it? It's quite good at whether we like it or not. It's quite good at changing and adapting and remaining in power, which is something I note in the book. That if you look over the last, say, 100 years, more than well over half that time, the Conservative Party has either been in government alone or the leading party in a coalition. So it's pretty good at doing what it takes to maintain in power. And I expect it will continue to be so if at some point that means ditching Johnson. But I'm not saying that's going to happen immediately.
Wonderful, thank you. Oh, if we could go on mute, Peter. Great, wonderful. Let's minimise the echo. I don't want to hear all of my own voice. Great. So moving on to the next question in the chat, we've got from Dr. M.J. Bendel. Yes, Minister, suggests Britain join the EEC and then the EU in order to scupper it. Too cynical. Peter, perhaps you want to take this one.
Actually, that is actually another good one for Andrew, the historian. But I really don't think there is sort of evidence for that. And I think going back to the history of the Conservative Party, it is fascinating. I mean, I think one of the things about writing the book I found is I've had to confront my own kind of personal sort of been lived all through these periods, like sort of the first referendum, and I kind of that kind of Conservative Party had this really strong pro-European wing, a really, set of people who really believed in the kind of project. And, something like, Ted Heath in the early 1970s, they were really passionate about it. And even Ted Heath actually managed to split his party to a certain extent on it. So it's amazing how Europe kind of really brings up all these kind of massive big issues of principles. So I don't think that was the case. Obviously, as years went on, I mean, I think that there was an argument, wasn't it, in the 1990s that the reason that Britain supported so much enlargement and extra countries joining Europe was to make it a more complex place. Again, I'm not sure if there is evidence for that. I think in general, I think Britain obviously, like any country, had to negotiate Europe. It has to kind of get its own way. And it had to be a constructive partner in Europe as well to kind of do those kind of deals. And a lot of the time, it managed that as I talked about, things like the Single European Act, all this sort of thing. So I'm not quite sure I agree with that question, but maybe there might be some secret memo in some archive we might uncover in future years.
Yeah, and I think if I can add to that, I think Charles de Gaulle, the French president in the 60s, may have suspected that's what we're up to, and that's why he vetoed membership. But as Peter says, no one's that clever, are they? And I think also the converse of that could almost be that in leaving, we've possibly driven it closer together in some ways, because there's two schools of thought. One was that after the UK leaves, other countries will leave. Well, that hasn't happened yet. It might happen one day. It hasn't happened yet. And in some ways, the EU has been unified in the kind of negotiation process with the UK. So there's some interesting things going on there, but I think it's not as simple as we join to sabotage. I mean, that'd be quite a great length to go to, wouldn't it?
Wonderful, some very balanced answers there. Thank you both. So the next question, I'm going off upvotes in the chat. So the next question is from Mitya. From doing the books, are there any aspects of contemporary British politics which you feel stand out comparatively, either ways in which the UK fits wider trends or looks distinctive from other countries? Sorry if you've covered this earlier, was just getting boosted during the first half of this. Congrats on getting a booster, Mattia. So yes, questions on things that stand out about British politics sort of in comparison to other countries.
Sorry, I think we've probably both had a stab at that. It's a really good question, actually. It's quite hard to answer. And I think obviously there's a lot of focus in the classic literature on British politics about the distinctiveness of British politics, the Westminster model, things I talked about in my intro, about the concentration of executive power, the focus on majorities. Obviously, the kind of first past the post-electoral system at Westminster are kind of key features. And they give a certain style to British politics. It's fast-moving, high stakes, unpredictability, even before the period of political turbulence. On the other hand, the comparative trends are really quite important. Obviously, degrees of decentralization are something which we've experienced comparatively. Obviously, you see the kind of expansions of different kinds of electoral systems, challenges to political parties, party membership, new political parties, populist challenges. So I think you can see, I think there's a balance here. I think in terms of the institutions tend to change more slowly. I think certainly in terms of political behaviour and parties, I think you can really see a lot of these kind of comparative changes. So it's classic academics. So it's a bit of one, a bit of the other.
Thanks, Peter. Sorry, we were getting a bit of feedback there. Andrew, did you want to speak to that question as well in terms of how the UK stands out comparatively?
Yeah, I think Peter's covered a lot of the main ground there. I'd say one interesting case study in there is the use of the referendum, which is something we've talked about doing in this country since the 19th century. But there's always an argument that it's not British, we don't do it. In fact, there's a pamphlet published in the 1990s called "No Referendums, Please, We're British." And this idea that we don't do it, but actually we've done them a lot now, or we've had 13 major referendums since 1973, and they've led to some pretty big events, like some of the ones we've lived through in the last few years, but also many other important things. So it's an interesting example of where we've taken on something from other countries, and in a weird way, although the referendum was used to take us out of the European Union, it was a sign of how much we'd taken on some of the features of the countries that were within the European Union, one of which was holding referendums on these big decisions. So I think it's there's a very interesting and complicated discussion to be had there.
Thank you. We've got some more time to cover a few more questions. So the next one is about voting behaviour and the next election. From Raymond. At this point, in previous long-lasting governments, New Labour, Thatcher, 51 to 64 Conservatives, there seemed to arise a degree of fatigue amongst voters towards the incumbent party, dissatisfied with the government's handling of crisis and scandal. Will the Conservative Party's reinvention under Johnson enable them to avoid such a phenomenon going into 2024? Really good question. Who wants to take that?
Sorry. Oh, I hate this feedback. Goodness. I'll speak really quickly and I'll put the back on again. I mean, futurology is really hard, isn't it? But there are these trends. I mean, basically, one is a kind of incumbency loss. So basically, the argument that each month a government's in power, it kind of loses them a little popularity because it's kind of acquiring errors and criticism. We can see that, currently. So governments are always playing a game as to whether they can. And obviously, in the midterm, it's kind of harder. And then effectively, what they try and do is turn it around towards the end through things like economic boosts, election promises, and those sort of things. The other part of that, obviously, is the opposition and how well that's doing. And obviously, the comparison of leadership is very important. I was just watching Keir Starmer just now, and I thought he did a pretty good job actually at PMQs. And so it may be the case. I think, but it's very hard. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the kind of peak Johnsonism obviously was just post that 2019, and then he's had to get through the kind of COVID crisis. So, and the public getting used to him, in a sense, of seeing all the the mess ups and all these sorts of things. It's a really hard call, so I think it might end up, it might in the end end up much closer as we get to the. But I think maybe Andrew, I know you're interested in the sort of red wall seats and how they're going to swing. So if you want to talk about that, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and maybe in some ways people are less likely to regard the period from 2010 as being the same government, because you had a coalition for 5 years, which was very much a novelty at the time, with one prime minister. Then and then that prime minister wins a small majority, then implodes with a referendum, and you have May for a while. Then you have a really big shift that we were talking about earlier. This kind of maybe shift in a more Brexit party populist type direction under Johnson. And I suppose Johnson, a bit like you might say this SNP in Scotland, almost is quite effective at appearing like he's in opposition when he's in power. Therefore, maybe he'll be able to kind of transcend some of those problems, but then he might also end up in big trouble before he gets to the next election. So it's very hard to call with Johnson, but it might be that will happen. And I guess last time Labour were out of power, they were out of power for 18 years. So that gives us another 7 years roughly from about now, which is at least one more election.
Thanks, Andrew. I just wanted to ask one last question. We've got 6 minutes left, and I think it's a really good question to ask in light of the recent Partygate and Christmas party scandal in the news. So Elizabeth asks, what is the modern Tory party's attitude to the traditional checks such as the judiciary and the press?
Very good one. Shall I? And then, I mean, I'm sure Peter's going to say the judiciary is an interesting one, because if you go back to the 70s, it used to be the Labour Party and people on the left who moaned about the judiciary basically thought they were all kind of middle class people defending established interests. Now those positions are almost flipped. Labour Party's led by a lawyer, after all, and you've got a Conservative Party that's got some lawyers in it, admittedly, but they tend to back to this. This is an area where the kind of populist way of interpreting Conservatives, and again, I don't say that's the whole explanation, is quite useful because it tends to depict, and if you look at their manifesto, one of the groups it singles out as being need to be more brought into line, to be more in tune with the common people, is the judiciary. And you know, they're anticipating at the moment reforms that might in some way reduce the scope of the judiciary. So I think there's been an interesting shift there overall, over again, a long-term shift where the Conservatives become increasingly hostile to the judiciary, and where that will end is not entirely clear. And then on the newspapers, I mean, their attitude. I mean, I think an example. Obviously, we now live in an era where there are other media other than newspapers, and if you look at the figures, still the most widely consulted media are TV news, and then I think the internet comes second. Then I think radio and press. But the point is, there are other players other than the press out there. There's online, although obviously some of the big newspapers like Daily Mail are also a big online presence. But the press still counts, is my point. Because if you look at the turnaround on the Owen Paterson scandal, they got the vote to drop the case against him and effectively abolish the Standards Committee through Parliament. The reason it was then U-turned was because newspapers that are normally very pro-government didn't like it. So I think the press still counts.
And in the social media, in the media chapter of my book, one of the things we discussed in class is how the media have all become like each other. So the old print media are doing social media, and they're all kind of trying to influence each other. So the ability of the old-fashioned media to sort of set the agenda is still there because they can get these stories out, and also the politicians are always still reading them, so they got this kind of instant access. I think in number 10, they're looking at the headlines all the time. On the Conservative Party, I think one of the things we sort of cover in the book is this concept of democratic backsliding, which again, going back to the comparative discussion earlier, that it's this kind of international phenomenon whereby some of the kind of internalized rules of politics have been gradually of democracy have been sort of gradually sort of forgotten about, and where self-interest, evading sort of laws have become much more common across the world. And it may be the case the Conservatives have actually picked up a bit of that in some of their attitudes to judiciary and other institutions. And it obviously is quite worrying for a democracy that some of these values are becoming entrenched. So I sort of agree a little bit with the question. Thank you.
Wonderful, thanks very much. Those are all the questions from our audience that were published in the Q&A. So I wanted to wrap up now with 2 minutes to spare to say thank you everyone for attending this webinar, and thank you Andrew and Peter for talking so thoughtfully and considerately about all of those points, and I hope you all found it very informative and engaging. So I'll leave you all to enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoons. Thank you all for coming. Goodbye.